Hi guys, Mitch from Japanese Tools Australia here with Greg, and today we're talking saws. So Greg, you've spent plenty of time on work sites in Japan using saws to produce full structures. I wanted to ask you, what makes a Japanese saw a little bit special?
Well, I think the most obvious thing is the fact that it cuts on the pull.
Right.
And that's what really differentiates it from any Western saw. And I suppose the benefit of that is that the saw is always in tension when you're cutting. So rather than pushing down into the piece where you've got the potential to sort of get the saw to lose its tension like that, if you're on the pull, it's always going to maintain tension while cutting. The other main thing for this kind of saw is the fact that you have both a crosscut tooth and a ripping tooth, which makes it very versatile. So this is probably the most used saw for a Japanese carpenter, this kind of saw. And they'll have them in various sizes. This is sort of a mid-range size. So there's some that are quite longer, there's some that are quite smaller. And these get quite a lot of use when cutting complex joints, scarf joints and the like. So I guess that's the main thing. They're very versatile, they're good to use, and they cut really well. So, yeah.
Nice. And this is the Ryoba style.
That's right, it's called a Ryoba.
Yeah.
Ryoba translated in English basically means both blades, and that's in reference to the fact that you get both kinds of blade, the rip and the crosscut.
So those have a dedicated geometry for each grain direction.
Yep.
Moving through the styles of Japanese saw, would you be able to tell us a bit about the spine saw? Yeah,
so this is a Dozuki with a spine on it, and this is for more detailed stuff. This particular model is generally used for cutting kumiko, and so very fine detailed work where you need a very, very fine kerf. And yeah, it's this has only got a crosscut blade, so it's not something that you'd have on a work site. It'd be more for a workshop kind of environment, but you will get a very clean, sharp cut, very accurate from one of these too. Yep.
Nice. So the single-sided saw without a spine?
Yep, so again, same sort of thing. It's more for work on the bench in the workshop, you know, more of a specific application in terms of cutting nice, clean cuts when doing joinery, finer joinery and cabinet making and things like that. Whereas like this one, like I said before, is more rough and ready for doing the bigger joints for construction purposes, so yeah.
Great. And finally, something like that.
Okay, so yeah, now we've got this very thin blade, and this is really for doing those really fine, tricky jobs, especially when you want to cut things flush, for example. You might have something protruding and you just want to take a clean cut and then maybe finish it off with a sander or a plane afterwards. It won't leave scratch marks in the piece, whereas something like this, with the teeth alternating out like that, it's always going to leave pretty bad scratch marks in the piece. So yeah, really fine detailed work, and as you can see, it's quite flexible. So yeah, it's actually called a double kitty in Japanese, and that means a dowel cutter. So if you have a dowel sticking out that you've used to fill, say, a screw hole, you'll use this to cut that protruding piece and then make it all smooth with the surface from which it's coming from.
Very nice. So, all right, if we have a swing of some saws and make some cuts?
Yeah, okay, let's get into it.
Before we get cutting, Greg, what's this?
Okay, so this is one half of a kanawatsugi, which is probably the strongest scarf joint in the Japanese carpentry repertoire of scarf joints. And it's a good example of why it really helps to have both kinds of cutting edge on your saw, because when you're having to do maybe 50 of these for a build, you want to do them quickly and efficiently, and if you're constantly chopping and changing between different saws, you know, it's just going to add an extra layer of complexity to the whole job. And because that occurs so much in Japanese carpentry, that's why we have a saw with the two different blades on each side. So that just gives you an example of the kind of, you know, constant need to switch between a rip cut here, for example, and a cross cut here and cross cut here. So yeah, I think that really illustrates why you need that kind of versatility with your saw. So, so to continue on with that, what I'll do is just show you how to make a few cuts using both the rip cut and the cross cut feature. So let's start off with a rip cut, which will form the shoulder of this pretty basic tenon that I've marked out. So I'm just going to establish the cut here using the ripping blade. And the teeth at the bottom of the blade are generally closer together than they are up the end, which sort of makes it easier to establish the cut. So you get a finer cut there. If you're starting off up here, it's a bit rougher, it's a bit coarser, and it's harder to make that establishing cut. So I'll do that, using my thumb as a bit of a guide, and just sort of take it all the way along the line to the other end of the piece. And there, I've established the kerf, and then it's just a matter of taking it down. And that should about do it. Okay, and then the next step is that we'll do the rip cut down the side of the tenon here. So for this, I'll need to have the vise. Okay, and it's pretty much the same principle. Established with a short cut at the lower end of the blade. But once it gets going, it's fine. And as you can see, it's really going through that grain quite easily, removing a lot of material. All right, so I'm just coming to the end of the cut now. And this sort of really demonstrates the versatility. I can just do that cut there, haven't quite finished it, take it out, flip it around, do a little bit of fine tuning on this side. And then it should just come off like that. And there we have it.
That looks great.
Yep, so pretty clean cut. Will need to be cleaned up with a plane, to get it to the standards of Japanese joinery. But as you can see, it's a pretty quick way to cut a tenon using that saw. Yeah.
Can we use the Dozuki and compare the two?
All right, now we'll have a go with the Dozuki. Now, as I mentioned before, it's for very fine work and it's really thin, so you'll get a very fine kerf. I think it's, probably less than a millimetre, this one, by the looks of it. Yeah, quite definitely. And so, this is sort of going to give you a much more clean and accurate cut, but of course, it isn't going to remove as much material as the saw I was using before. So it will take more time, but that's why you'd use this for finer, smaller work. But I'm just cutting along this line here. It's not going nearly as quickly as it was with the Ryoba. But as you can see, the cut is almost indistinguishable from the original line. It's so thin and straight.
And the kataba as well?
Yeah, so the kataba, similar to the Dozuki, good for clean cuts, very thin kerf, but doesn't remove as much material as quickly as the carpenter's saw. So let's just have a little cut demonstration with that. And this one's slightly bigger than the one I was using before. But goes quite well on the crosscut, quite a thin kerf. But as you mentioned, I think this is also capable of doing a rip as well. Cutting on the rip as it was on the crosscut.
Final saw I wanted to ask you about
Yep.
is the Thin Man.
The Thin Man, or the double kitty as they call it in Japan. The real advantage of this is not only its flexibility, but the fact that the teeth aren't going to leave scratch marks in the piece when you're making a cut that's flush. So if we can do a little demonstration of that, I'll show you what I'm talking about.
And then we had one that we prepared
Oh,
earlier.
well, look at that. All right, fantastic. So if I just apply a little bit of pressure with my left hand there and commence the cut. And there we have it, a pretty well flush cut. Just do another one. And so like we'll often have these to, you know, I mean, it's no secret, but in Japanese traditional carpentry we do have to use screws sometimes, and but we will hide the screws by sinking a dowel above them and gluing them in, and then we'll use this flush cut saw to take that dowel off, and as a final finish we might use the hand plane just to plane the whole surface, and it ends up looking pretty good.
So if you could only have one, which would you pick?
That's a good question, Mitch. It'd definitely have to be this one here.
So if you couldn't have that one, which of these four would you pick?
In all seriousness, I'd definitely go for the Ryoba.
Right.
The mid-sized Ryoba. It just does everything you need to do. It's got the dual functionality. It means you don't have to have two saws. You've just got one. It's easier to carry around, and it's just really versatile.
Nice.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks heaps, Greg.
Thank you.